Today is the 25th of August 2026, and I saw this article pop up over the weekend on John Waters' Substack advertising the latest Mise Éire festival happening in Castlebar on September the 19th, 2026. And I thought it'd be worth having a little chat about this. So, who am I? Whenever I leave a comment on a pro EU video or any video talking about how wonderful contemporary Ireland is, I'm immediately accused of being a sock puppet. My channel has nothing to do with socks. Or I'm accused of being a bot, or even a dastardly Russian. Well, I have one of these, and I know this is greatly undervalued document these days, as every African o Irishman and Seamus o Indian has one of these now. And I've no idea how long I can keep logging into my YouTube channel prior to the complete closing of the circuit by the technocracy. But I'm Irish, and my family has lived on these islands for the last 10,000 years. And I care what happens because it directly affects the quality of my life, my family's life, etc. So I've never been part of the mainstream, and I look askance at everything. And a couple of years ago, I went to the Saoirse Creatives Tua de Danann that was down in Fermoy. And I enjoyed it. It was good, and the best part of it was really talking to other people who were attending. But everybody was very spread out. It's a small number of people, and then they're spread out across the whole country. So it makes it very difficult to develop anything out of that. Because what greatly saddens me is that in the 5 years since the sniffles scandemic happened, no grassroots counterculture has emerged. All that's happened is we have people talking on podcasts to one another and going around in circles. And as Matthias Desmond said a couple of years ago, when the talking completely stops, that's where the totalitarian systems begin, and we find ourselves in the killing fields of the Khmer Rouge. So talking is very important. And I'm going to come back to that. But first things first, we have this article that Mr. Waters published. And to my eyes, please correct me if I'm wrong. Please do drop a comment if I've got this wrong. But this image very much looks like an AI generated image. And I understand how the world works, that there's all kinds of copyright issues in using photography, videos, other people's work, and all of those things are becoming ever greater, tightly restricted. If you look at paperback books being published in recent years, and if you look at albums that have come out, like on recent record store days, if you're interested in that, the artwork is abysmal because the corporations don't want to pay 5 cents to a photographer or an artist or a painter for making an image. So the AI becomes this tool of convenience. But what do we lose in this soulless simulacrum? You know, if it was impossible to use real pictures, real photographs from 1916 to 1923, are there not paintings we could use? Drawings? I don't know. So that's just one. This just stands out to me when it really jumps out at me. Um, the use of AI, and then we have to Pierce's poem. I am Ireland. I am older than the old woman of Bear. Great my glory, I who bore Cuchulainn the brave. Great my shame, my own children who sold their mother. Great my pain, my my irreconcilable enemy who harasses me continually. Great my sorrow, that crowd in whom I placed my trust died. I am Ireland. I am lonelier than the old woman of Bear. And as we all know, history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme its endless crimes. And just as most people in Ireland couldn't give a feck in 1916, most people today couldn't give a feck. You know, Ireland is a very strange place. For such a small population, it's amazing the talent that has come out of this country, the artists, the writers, the musicians. There's amazing talent in this country. But as you make your way through life, you realize most Irish people are idiots, morons, gullible fools being processed into a technocratic dystopia while their culture and heritage is eradicated. And no one wants to hear one of their own criticizing their country. It's hardly a way of making friends and influencing people, is it? Well, I would just say that it's much the same if you were in England, France, Germany, Sweden, Canada, America, Australia, New Zealand. Most people are happy little piggies in the trough of consumerism and embracing all the latest technological conveniences that saves them time to do what? I don't know, watch more box sets on Netflix. I don't know. What are you supposed to do with all this time you're saving? No one seems to have more time. So, anyway, you know, I'm someone who I don't support any political party. Um, I'm not here promoting a religious point of view. I'm not Catholic, and I'm certainly not an atheist. Uh, and when I grew up in the Ireland where 95% of people were Catholic, it's clear that most of them were running Catholicism as a kind of software program, like the base code layer of their reality. They didn't actually have any strong individual faith. It was more about culture. Um, because real spiritual connection is about a personal relationship with the divine nature and the dynamic living world that surrounds us. So those people were processed into a fake liberal liberation of progressivism, which is a kind of repackaged Bolshevism and Trotskyism designed to break your connection to the past and your ancestors, you can't have a traditional culture and at the same time have rainbow flags. It's not possible. And at the same time, as Normie Ireland has gone back to sleep as fast as possible once all the lockdown restrictions happened and everybody just wants to forget anything happened, um, you know, we're in a terrible situation on a cultural, political, economic level. You know, I'd say to any younger person who, particularly those denizens of the wasteland of Reddit, that you must understand that if you think your elders are misguided racists and bigots, you know, more radical change has has been forced through in the last 5 years than the previous 20 years. And terms like racism and right wing are designed to get inside the privacy of your head, to question your own perception and intuition, to make you fear saying things that step outside the norm of the Overton window. Because that's what's happened. What I'd say to people on Reddit is that anybody using the term right wing is an idiot and a fool, because the term right wing is a term given to you by the ruling class to control the limits of public debate. The ownership of this country, its sovereignty, and the continued existence of the Irish people is not, to talk about these issues, is not right wing. All through the 90s, probably through the 90s up until maybe 2010, 2012, I'd always thought of myself as being very liberal and existed completely outside the norm of Irish society and culture. I was never part of Catholic Ireland. And what we call liberal now, to me, is it's Bolshevism used as a weapon to break up the society, to process it into a technocratic surveillance police state where you have no human rights, but only privileges that are given and taken away from you by the all-seeing eye of a anti-human technological system. If you get a ticket for breaking a red light or being a jaywalker crossing the road, you're not going to court. That ticket will just be taken out of your digital bank account automatically. And if you want to raise an objection, you'll only be dealing with AI bots, which will offer you instant video of your apparent crime. So, I've been thinking recently I'd like to get out again to somewhere in nature and make a video just talking about how we all need to be thinking about the Butlerian jihad. What is Butlerian jihad? But it is a concept from Frank Herbert's Dune novels, a means of using concepts from popular culture to open conversation about our current predicament. Because in those books, they reject the idea that machines should do thinking for human beings, because it's a basic denial of the dignity and value of human life. And we're rapidly running into that now. So, one of the things going on is we're always presented with dialectics. If you're on the left-hand side, you're being massaged by Bolsheviks. And if you're on the right hand side, you're being massaged by Zionists. And that's your only choice in Europe, North America, and in Western civilization. Everything falls along either side of that divide. Left wing Bolshevism or right wing Zionism. Right? So I don't support either side. Two wings of the same bird and the same family. So when presented with the dialectic, always look for the third option because it's always there, it's just not immediately apparent or advertised or promoted to you, but it's always there, silently waiting to be discovered. So as everybody argues over various psyops designed to use your precious human energy like a battery and use the collective unconscious to generate the desired reality on behalf of the parasites that be, I would always ask, well, regardless of you being left wing or right wing, what do we have in common as human beings? I'd ask, do we want data centers? Who do data centers benefit? Do we want human beings turned into robots? I think if you just lay out all the plans of the architects and engineers of the society, most ordinary people would say, I don't want to live like that. This is madness. But of course, we get that incremental change to make things seem inevitable. But I never voted for data centers, and I certainly didn't vote for the Lisbon Treaty. So anyway, there's lots of things to talk about, and John Waters in his article was talking about his memories and so on, and of course there's no point me making any comment on those. It's just, and he's talking about Neil Oliver. I think Neil Oliver is going to this Mise Éire event. And he's a kind of curious figure because he's such a normie type who worked for the BBC and then seemed to have this realization of the evils of the system. And it's a bit odd because I guess, I don't know, is he in his 50s or older to have this sudden realization? Because that's the realization I had between, I suppose, 10 and 12 years old, that teachers, doctors, civil servants, politicians certainly do not care whether you live or die, whether you prosper or suffer. You know, it's a historical fact that the technocrats who are in the real positions of power now, or the children and grandchildren of eugenicists, that's who these people are. They view you as a biological resource, cattle. They used you to build this industrial revolution, and now it's been built, you're all useless eaters because they have their AI, they have their robots. And why would we want uneducated, low IQ aliens flooding the West when we're meant to be reducing emissions, supposedly, because of climate change? Why would we want all these people consuming more in the West? And, well, the simple answer is they're there to break up the heritage, indigenous population, to ease them into the technocracy. Because people from poor countries aren't going to be protesting anything. they're living a life of luxury compared to what they would experience in their native countries and cultures. And people don't come to the West to join our story, to have their stories woven into the tapestry of our culture. They're not in love with our language and poetry and music. They're here for economic opportunity. And when you bring in so many people, what you start doing is eradicating the native culture. For anybody on the left, I would ask them a simple question. I would ask them, do Native Americans have a right to exist in this world? Do Native Americans have a right to practice their indigenous culture and spiritual beliefs? Or are they just in the way of the technocratic utopia, tokenizing all life on this green earth, right? So anyway, it's curious Mr. Oliver had this realization so late in life. I guess it's possible. Anything is possible. But I just wanted to say, the reason I decided I'd make this video is because Mr. Waters was talking about trolls asking ridiculous. Hang on, let's see if I can highlight this. Trolls asking ridiculous questions, snide innuendos. It's quite true. And then the most irritating thing is when people suggest that we shouldn't be sitting around talking, but should be doing something. Whenever you ask them what we should be doing, they lose their tongues. Of course, as I pointed out, talking is doing. It's the most important element of consciousness raising, which is the sole route to recovering our lives and our country. So yeah, it's absolutely is vital that we talk, that we offer our voices, because then, so often in life, the loudest person in the pub, in the party, in the family, whatever, the loudest person is talking because they want the attention like a vampire, but they have nothing to say. While the quietest person, the introspective person, the sensitive person, the artistic person sits in silence in the corner of the room and says, I don't want to be involved in any of this ugliness and stupidity. Well, it's important to add your voice to the cultural conversation, because otherwise people assume you don't exist, and ordinary people assume there is no other voice, there is no voice in opposition. So yeah, talking is very important, but it's not going to free us or liberate us. As I said, it's been shocking how no grassroots movement has emerged, and we look at where could those grassroots things come from. Well, it's not really too much of a surprise or a shock to understand why the GAA is so woke, is it? Or why you have Muslims praying in Croke Park. It's not hard to understand that at all, is it? Because what would be an easier way of organising young men in Ireland than through sport? So yeah, you got to make it as woke as possible. I mean, speaking as a political and philosophical anarchist, I bend the knee to no man. All authority is a fiction that's only enforced through violence. So the state is always the biggest gang on the block. They always have the monopoly on violence. So everything else is the massaging of the mind with endless psyops and cultural engineering. You have to notice in recent years how there's been a push to promote the Irish language again to people. Because again, there's a means for people to privately organise, talk to one another, reclaim their culture. So the state has to get in there. The state is always trying to get in there to interfere in your business. A couple of years ago, I went to the cinema, and before the film started, this Irish government advert comes on talking about how you must always have consent in your personal romantic relationships, should I say. And it was all I could do to stop myself from vomiting all over the seats in the cinema. I've never seen anything so disgusting in my life. Again, can I say to anybody who's under, like, I don't know, 30 years old, this is not normal. This never existed in our culture before. This is what you get in socialist and communist countries. The state being involved in all your business. The business of the state is to build roads and run hospitals and collect taxes. When they're running adverts telling you how to behave with your boyfriend and girlfriend, that's a society going into totalitarian madness. This is not normal. This is telling you where you are on the totalitarian timeline. So, all nonsense has to be called out. And we can go on talking forever, going around in circles, talking and talking, and nothing changes. And for some people, I guess they can make a career going around the same podcasts, talking and talking, and the same audience listens to them. And I doubt converting very many people. I mean, listen, I can watch the Duran, get the latest news from Iran and the Ukraine, and they can talk about all these terrible casualties, and they can talk about inevitable economic problems that are going to result from these conflicts. But it will make no difference to the final outcome. You can listen to Scott Ritter endlessly babble on about the madness of current American foreign policy till the veins are bulging out of his head and he looks like he's about to have a stroke. Well, dedicating your life to calling out the lies of the military industrial complex and Zionist foreign policy is not going to change anything. It is not going to change a single thing. The only thing that would change is if the collective mass of people went on a general strike, if they stopped paying their taxes, if 1 million people went and stood outside the Dáil, the Irish Parliament, and said, "We're not leaving until you all get the feck out of here." And at the beginning of this year, we had the fuel protests, and I wondered, would this come to anything? And I guessed it wouldn't, and unfortunately I was proved right, because the farmers and hauliers, they got their few sent off their excise duty or whatever, and they all went back to sleep. And the whole thing seemed like another psyop. I'm sure most people involved in it were completely genuine people. But the people instigating it, controlling it, managing it, promoting it, what was the result? The result was that the guards, the police, the state, the spooks, they could run all their information warfare. They could trace where did information emerge from, who picked it up, where did it go to, what was the end result, who was connected to who was talking to who. They could collect all that information and they could run a live training drill to see what would happen if this happens. What happens if you block streets or block ports or access to refineries or whatever? They could collate all that information as a live exercise. So if anything happens in the future, they have all that info collated, fed into the AI overlords. You know, like I say to people, if you're going to a protest, for the love of God, leave your smartphone at home, because your signals are being monitored. Who you're talking to, who you're sending a message to, and following you all the way back to where you live and who you're related to, etc., etc. If you're not capable of thinking about these things, the art of war and the Machiavellian machinations, if you can't grasp these concepts, then you're so far out of your depth. You're just a pawn in the game. If you're looking at the chessboard and you can't figure out who the pawn is, then it's you. What we see in our society is basically a game of chess being played by one person, gradually nudging us and prodding us like a mouse in a maze. And Irish people are like lemmings walking off the cliff while the siren song of the mass media is promising them a rainbow bridge shall appear as they place their foot on nothingness. Right? So, the mainstream are completely brain damaged, most likely in both a metaphorical and biological sense. They don't grasp at all their moment in history of where they are. And young people just accept the world the way it is, as they're bombarded with more propaganda than any other generation in the previous 100 years. Like what I see looking at Ireland is that since around 2012, Ireland has been ruled by PSYOP, and then it went into overdrive from 2016 to 2020. I mean, do you remember in that time period, kids leaving school to protest climate change? I've never seen such outrageous Bolshevik street theater in my life. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It's like, this is like, am I living in Invasion of the Body Snatchers or what? Total madness. I mean, to seeing Irish society progress to that point of children being used by the most vile politicians, by the loony Greens. Greens are the watermelons of the West. Green on the outside, red on the inside. You can go down a rabbit hole of where the Greens emerged from in Germany, post-war Germany and Cold War, and you end up in a situation where on one hand, the German state wants to go to war with Russia, and on the other hand, they're deindustrializing all their car factories and whatever. It's all total madness. And the youth are ushered into idiocracy. But you always have to give people stories. You always have to give them a narrative. And ordinary people unwittingly buy into these narratives because, midwits always want to be up to date. They always want to be up to date with everything. And, get the latest software update downloaded straight into your brain, because nothing could be more terrifying than being old-fashioned or out of date or out of the loop. Well, of course, any sane person just wants to turn all this nonsense off and ignore it and live the quiet life following their own dreams and desires. The midwit is essentially, they've outsourced the higher functions of their mind and soul to the state and corporations. They view themselves as being sophisticated because they've downloaded the latest thinking. They're deeply pathetic people. Essentially, they are unwittingly, what I'd say is, you can make a whole video on this, but what I would say is midwits are the capos of liberal democracy. What is a capo? A capo is someone in a concentration camp who was a prisoner given extra privileges to watch over other prisoners because he didn't have enough guards in a concentration camp to keep it functional and all the inmates under control. So that's who you are, midwits. You don't want to know. You don't want to look at your shadow. You just want to download instructions and act them out. You're just pathetic, cowardly people. And it would be okay if we were still living in a tribal society, because there's safety in the tribe. But that natural feature of human beings to be tribal has been completely manipulated by us moving into a technocratic system, because now we're all being isolated and atomized while at the same time given collective stories and narratives to make sense of the world, why things are the way they are. It's a historical fact that the Club of Rome in the 1960s, who were talking about the world being divided into 10 regions and a multipolar system, which seems what Trump is trying to do on behalf of the owners. And only a midwit can possibly get upset or give any of their precious life force to being annoyed by Trump or any politician. Trump is just an actor. If Trump didn't exist tomorrow, someone else would be enacting exactly the same policies. And, if it was Kamala Harris elected instead of Trump, exactly the same thing would be happening in Israel and Palestine. For the love of God, use your brain. God gave you that organ for a reason, and he granted you the cosmic gift of free will, but you don't appreciate it at all. You only know how to live as a lemming. So we're trapped between people talking, alternative people talking, and the midwits fast asleep. So change could only come by mass disobedience. I think the parasites would be quite happy for a civil war, because it gives them the excuse to bring in martial law and the surveillance state. But it's funny, the technology is all there already in existence. It's all there in the background, but they just need to craft the storyline to the point where people accept its emergence. But it's all already there. We don't have to have physical ID cards when I go into Super Value, to buy a loaf of bread, that you're filmed at the checkout like a fucking prisoner in Mountjoy. It's just sickening. I mean, you gotta love the videos at the cameras in Marks and Spencer's telling you it's for your safety. Oh, that makes me feel a lot better, Safety and security, and will no one think of the children? They're all Trojan horses. They're all emotional manipulations of gullible, foolish people, and people too innocent for the Machiavellian psychos. The reason we don't talk about Wall Street and the central bankers and the 0.1% is because we're all talking about, black versus white, men versus women, young versus old. It's all divide and conquer. It's all about pushing you into a subgroup that encourages you to think of other subgroups as subhuman. So we get this. Don't get me wrong. I was thinking of I might go to this. Mise Éire presents the risen people. But you got to laugh at the same time. The risen people sounds good. And it's a photograph of a crowd of middle-aged people all sitting down. The world is made of signs and symbols, and they're all winking at each other. You see, my problem with things like this is it's great that it exists and people can go and listen to some ideas and opinions, but it's a bit like, when you go and watch the Rolling Stones in concert and you got Mick Jagger dancing like a holy fool, and what he's doing is acting as like an avatar to draw the attention of the vast audience upon him, to give the audience something to focus on. And he's channeling that in a kind of rock and roll shamanic tradition. Well, these things are a bit like this. You see, we can go and have all our focus placed on Neil Oliver and John Waters and Derek Domino, Ivor Cummins. I do recall, now correct me if I'm wrong, tell me if I'm wrong, but I recall Mr. Cummins was recommending the jab before he didn't recommend the jab. Now, honestly, I would say the people I would like to meet the most, this is just my personal opinion, would probably be these horses. These look very nice. It looks a bit AI, but I'd be delighted to meet a couple of horses. A lamb. I'd be absolutely delighted to spend an afternoon with the lamb, or a donkey. Certainly more sense than most people, I mean, in my day-to-day life, I have more intelligent conversations talking to the local seagull than the average person. When I talk to my cat, I feel like I'm talking to Oscar Wilde compared to the average muppet. Who's that? That's Eddie Hobbs there. Yeah, he seems a bit dubious. Am I wrong? Tell me I'm wrong. But you see, I've nothing, I believe completely in free speech, and talking is vital, but talking isn't the doing. It's not going to change anything. We're talking to people who already agree with us. The audience is more important than the speakers. The audience is what gives the energy to a Rolling Stones concert. We are the generators of the dream, and the sleeping masses are generating the dream of the 0.1%. And I think this was known back to the time of the pharaohs. And for the black sheep and the lone wolves and the loony shamans who exist outside the morphic resonance of the collective, well, we're always there, saying, there's another way of living, there's another way of doing things, there's another way of seeing this. So, nothing is accomplished when you go to something like this and you go home. It can be nice in a way that you feel, oh yeah, there's other people who see the world as mad. Like when I went down to Fermoy there a couple of years ago, there's a great power in physically meeting people and being around them and saying, oh yeah, I'm not the only one. I'm not completely mad. And other people question this. Other people see right through all the lies and madness. And it gives you a bit of hope. But then you go back home and you're back talking to pigeons and seagulls in desperate desire for an intelligent conversation with someone. And it all just fizzles out. So you go, okay, well, we'll do this next year. That's great. And we'll another year further into the prison. I think maybe we all have maybe around 5 years at the most before we're fully into kind of like a AI judge, jury, and executioner, digital currency, etc., etc. I mean, like for years, I've been talking about and leaving comments on whoever could care less about digital ID and digital euro, and all those things are well in progress, but hardly anybody is talking about it. You need ordinary people talking about these things, and you need ordinary people saying, do I want to live like this? And you want to give them an example of other ways of living. Like the simplest thing is, like you spend cash when you go to the supermarket, and then you notice all these young people around you, they're just buying a flipping can of Coke with their phone. Why are they doing that? Has that young person ever come into contact with the countercultural idea? Or are we just all like, gradually, becoming middle-aged people, fading out with our memories of a analog past? But what can you say in the end? You see, I think there's more power in if you had in every village, every town in Ireland, 5 people, or if you want to go crazy, like 10 people, just having a conversation with one another every week about the state of the world, and how you can create parallel systems. You see, we can talk about, you should buy gold and silver, and you should buy a couple of months worth of food, and you should eat organic food, and look into alternative medicine. You can take garlic pills instead of taking blood pressure pills. It's great knowledge, share with people, talk about things. It's all very useful, but in the end, it has to be about creating parallel systems in reality. I suppose it's just about caring about one another, what happens. Like if someone goes into a hospital, someone going to check if they get out alive. You know, like if we're all just in our little bubble trying to preserve a sliver of sanity in the privacy of the four walls of our home, you know, we can all kind of drop out. We can all kind of withdraw. The madness certainly can make us feel like our only hope is to withdraw and build our own lifeboats on arcs, to sit in our library reading the books, having conversations with the intellectuals of some Arcadian pre-corrupted past. And we could spend our time, we could watching movies from the 50s and 60s and listening to our records from the 70s and 80s and pretending that there isn't this storm on the horizon gradually making its way towards us. So what do we do? Do we rise up and take on the state? It's impossible unless you're in a situation where you could turn the majority of people, like the solidarity movement that happened in Poland, which helped end the Soviet Union. You have to have solidarity across a society to achieve something like that, and that's why we're all ruled by divide and conquer. But it's just so sad looking at the normies who believe their comfortable life is going to continue. Really, the reality of revolutions is that people couldn't care less about anything when you can watch the telly, drink beer, you got food in the fridge. People are only coming out onto the street when things become so expensive. Ordinary life is impossible. People always, ordinary people always wait too late. Essentially, the more comfortable your existence is, the more you're living in a kind of fantasy. Like the wealthier you are, the further back in time your consciousness resides. If you're well off, you're pretty much imagining you're still living in 90s Ireland. And boomers can imagine they're living in 90s Ireland. Generation X can imagine they're living in the kind of 2000s, and so on and so forth. It's only when the rubber meets the road they realize they're in 2030 and there's no hope of protesting anything when you're cut out of the economy with a click of the mouse. So if you really grasp our predicament at this present moment in the timeline, You'd be doing everything you can to organize parallel systems outside of the state. But of course, in Europe, we're also socialized that from cradle to grave, the state runs everything. You know, people don't go out and pick up pieces of rubbish on the road unless they're wearing a flipping yellow vest. People don't make music or put on a comedy show unless it's in association with the uh, arts grant and the county council. There's so little sense of initiative. And I suppose it's always been the way that anybody in Europe who gets sick of the endless red tape and bureaucracy and the mediocrity of the culture inside, they all go to America. And that's always been the way. But for those of us still here, your future is going to be something between Jamaica and South Africa. Multicultural, multi-ethnic societies existing in grinding poverty and endless tribal warfare. I've been to South Africa, and when the neighbor knocks on your door to ask you, are you okay, while he has a flipping Glock on his waistband, what you get is, if you're wealthy, you go into a armed and gated community. If you're middle class, you put bars on your window. If you're working class, you live in perpetual conflict with your surrounding balkanized tribal communities. And that's what you're going to get in Ireland and Europe. And as the indigenous people slide into being the minority, what you're going to find is an ever more cruel and violent society. That's what a multicultural society is. It's a more violent and cruel place. The next time you have to go into a hospital in Ireland, pray to God you're going to get someone who understands and speaks English, someone whose qualifications haven't been forged. And if the HSE wants to sue me, bring it on, because then we could have discovery in open court. Because I could tell you endless horror stories. That's the reality. And how do you rule over a multi-ethnic, multicultural society? You rule over it with an iron fist and a surveillance state. It's why you had people like Saddam Hussein in charge of Iraq or Gaddafi in charge of Libya. They maintained control. With boots on the ground. European people are lambs to the slaughter in their high trust societies. It's not about the colour of people's skin. It's about their culture and their beliefs. We don't all, this is the thing, we don't all exist in the same reality. Every person walking around is in their own private reality inside their brain. Some people are running a software program called Irish and Catholic, and other people are running a software program called Hinduism or Islam. there is no consensus reality. There is only then the ultimate authority of the state, those who have the monopoly on violence. So it's all unfolding, and we're all talking about it. We're all trying to raise consciousness, but you have to put it into practice. You have to be an example to ordinary people of ways of living. You have to reject the technocracy. You have to reject the idea that the ultimate goal of humankind is to achieve a singularity with technology. You know, that's not a left wing or right wing issue. The hope for humanity is the Butlerian jihad, which is a conscious rejection of living like this. I mean, we're in this bizarre situation where the entire planet and human genome is being terraformed into a transhuman hellscape that is becoming something like the eighth sphere that Rudolf Steiner predicted 100 years ago. You know, we can all go and watch the Rolling Stones in concert. But what matters much more is if you have a band playing in the local pub every weekend that you support. The future for humanity can only be local, not global. You know, I'd make money from my YouTube channel if I was endlessly making videos talking about how terrible Star Trek and Star Wars and Supergirl and Superman is. But it's far more productive to make the art you want to see, to write the books you want to read, to make the music you want to hear. And those things aren't going to make you a millionaire. But we're meant to create our own culture. We're not meant to be passive observers, just open-mouthly consuming corporate junk. You know, do people think, oh, it'd be a better world if we could convince Hollywood to make better movies? That's madness. We have to forget about all this corporate junk. The point is to be the change you want to see. The point is to talk to one another. The point is that the audience there are more important than the speakers. The point is it would make a greater change if people in every town and village were meeting every weekend, talking about their life and how to live and the ways and means you can get around the enclosure of this human zoo. You see, everything is infiltrated by spooky agents, and you know, half of Substack feels like it's people arguing with one another about who's real and who's fake, and it's all just wasting your precious energy. You know, what I've thought the last few years is we need to stop putting people on pedestals. We need to stop looking for leaders to lead us out of the abyss. I thought the simplest thing would be to have a set of principles that people agree to, like a .org organization. And you'd have 10 points and you'd agree to them and then say, if you agree to those things, then we're having a conversation in the pub on Saturday or whatever, in the local cafe. And I know what happens is that, the far left loonies look for things to come and protest and infiltrate and whatever. You see, what happens if you look at history, when you get subversive movements and paramilitary movements and people doing funny handshakes, what happens when you have secret organizations is that they're easily infiltrated and influenced and manipulated, as one can see through the history of the Troubles. But I think if you have open organizations without leaders, without any secrets, there's nothing to infiltrate, there's nothing to manipulate. An example would be things saying, I agree in the sovereignty, in national sovereignty. I believe in the right of Indigenous people to their self-determination. I believe in bodily autonomy. I believe corporations and governments do not own people, their bodies, or their organs. Those are like a set of principles, and you could write out perhaps 10 principles and say, I agree to those, and then someone else says, yeah, I agree to that. So there's a basis for 2 people, 3 people. You could go crazy, maybe even like 4 or 5 people get together and say, yeah, I agree with those things, that way of life. I agree. Don't want to live in a technocratic panopticon. So we could have a chat about that. But once you place yourself in a dialectic, left-wing Bolshevism, right-wing Zionism, you're just placing yourself in that political process which leads nowhere. Like one way of thinking about it, is with our terrible healthcare system and all the evils of allopathic healthcare, what you could do is you could dedicate your life to campaigning against it, campaigning against its evils. Or the other thing you could do is you could just walk away from it and set up your own alternative health system. Your own, you could set up an acupuncture business or a massage business. So which is more productive? Complaining about something you don't like or making something better, putting it into existence? I see so many, there's so much rubbish on the internet that's particularly YouTube, that's all about complaining about things, complaining about, giving bad reviews to restaurants and complaining about modern literature, complaining about modern music, complaining about modern films and TV shows. Well, the simplest thing is you walk away from it. You make the culture you want. You create your own culture. It's this really crazy idea that the people in a society are the ones who create their culture, rather than passively consuming endless garbage from corporations and governments. No corporation or government cares whether you live or die, whether you're healthy or sick. You are nothing more than a cash cow with a price attached to your brain, your consciousness, and all your vital organs. That is all you are. Something I figured out when I was a child. It seems it's taken some people till middle age to figure it out with all the nonsense that's happened in the last 5 years. And what the normies and the midwits are doing. They're deciding in some kind of unconscious death wish that they're only going to awaken in the most painful way possible, in the most traumatic way, when sunlight streams in to the broken bunker in Berlin and all the cognitive dissonance evaporates in that golden light, and they realize, oh, hang on, you know what? I actually got it all wrong. Well, that's what's going to happen at one stage or another when you realize things you took for granted no longer exist. When things that you grew up with are now considered extreme or racist. When you find in your little village there's a block of apartments and 500 aliens living there, who's going to be the dominant culture then? Well, that's just my opinion. For whatever it's worth, as someone who grew up in this country, whose parents grew up in this country, and grandparents and great grandparents. So you can let me know. You can let me know what you think in this moment in time we find ourselves in. You can say, yeah, or no, or no, or